Hello again, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Fun and Games Podcast. I'm Geoff Moonen.
And I am at AK Stormageddon.
And you're listening to episode 175. And this episode, we're going to look at history, at the present, possibly even the future. But when we look at these things, maybe they should stay behind the glass case that they're in, because sometimes a game is historically important or culturally important, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's a good game. Or do they have to be good to be important? That's really what we're talking about here.
Yeah, I like this idea, and it came to me. I feel like I was listening to one of the myriad of indie podcasts that I listened to, and there was a similar conversation, but I was like, what if we took it to the next level? And this idea that historic games like Super Mario 64 are often touted for changing the landscape of 3D platformers, and it is an incredible game to boot. But there are games that were notoriously terrible or mires in the industry that are also celebrated and I think are just as equally important to gaming history. I think to start, to give an example that everyone knows, is to talk about E.T., the extraterrestrial for Atari. This is a historic game that is important to video games and the video game crash, but it is not a good game. As someone who spent many hours trying to play it when it came out, because that's how old I am, it is a bad game. But there's no denying the impact this game had on the history of video games and what video games meant and what they were not capable of on some level.
Oh, certainly about the idea of there are limitations to programming and to crunch and to everything else, because this was one of those situations that unfortunately still happens in some form or another. All of this information that I'm about to say is off the top of my head. It was a single programmer given a very small number of weeks, somewhere around 6 weeks, to create the game. And this was meant to coincide with the release of the film, with the hype of it and everything else. And definitely carried a little bit of, well, the name will sell it. We have the license, so just make something and make it good. That we end up with where we are as far as E.T. as a game goes. E.T. was not the straw that broke the camel's back in terms of causing the video game crash, but it is historically important because it is one of the better examples that stands alone. I also would argue that Pac-Man for the Atari 2600, which came out around the same time, is also a shining example of quick turnaround, poor design, poor implementation. I will die on the hill of Pac-Man for the 2600 is an abysmal game and is no less important in that. But you say, well, Pac-Man caused the crash. Doesn't have the same ring to it because there's a lot more of those, but there really haven't been E.T. games other than the 2600. But it works in terms of context of looking back on, well, what happened with games or what happened with these things or why was the NES released the way that it was? Because the Western gaming public, as it was in 1985, didn't have the same sort of trust, or certainly not retailers have trust for video games from Japan. And so they needed to set everything up, or they felt the need to pack in Rob as a toy. They needed to design the NES so that it looked more like either a personal computer or a VCR, an appliance, not a little goofy video game thing that's going to do all these other things. So whether or not they needed to make that Trojan horse or not, it is still what they felt and what was done built on the lack of trust from games like E.T. There were plenty of others, but right now, decades later, it's an easy one to point to. And if you want to do your research, it's a great place to start.
Yeah, for sure. And I think there are a lot of different lines we can point to of what things had a positive impact on the game industry, even if the games were bad. I mean, meme culture as a whole can be traced back, I think, on some level to the Philips CDI Zelda games, which we've talked about quite a few times on this podcast. But like taking a terrible game and drawing a straight line to what I consider a success, Arzette and the Jewel of Faramore, like that game for me was a hit. I loved it. And I think it's a really well-made game that is ripping on something that was considered widely terrible and unplayable and making it fit the vibe of that, but giving it the improvements to make it still a game that's worth playing and is quite very good. And for sure, Arzette is not the only one, but is one of quite a few of games that are like, hey, remember that bad thing? What if we go back to that bad thing, but make it better and learn the lessons directly from that game? Because, I mean, you've played Arzette now also.
Yeah.
it's a one-to-one creation, vibes-wise, at least from one to the other,
Certainly,
but definitely
yeah.
not control and not load speeds and not quality of certain things. And I think that's fascinating.
Well, and that works for something like the CDI Zelda games because plenty of people, certainly those that know gamer culture, gamer memes in one fashion or another, are familiar with the Zelda CDI games, even if you've never held a CDI controller or played them on emulator. I haven't. I've never played the Zelda CDI games. I only know them through memes or through videos or through magazine articles or through word of mouth. But I feel as though I don't know everything, but what I know about it is accurate. And so you can take a game that recreates the vibes, very much so, and make a better game out of it because you don't have the same feeling under your fingers that you might recreating a game from your youth. Matt, you and I often talk about games like Shovel Knight that are, they play the way you remember, not the way they were. But another example where you do have a game that has a wider install base of tactile memory is a game like Infernax, which came out a few years ago. We got to have Hunter Bond on the show talking about that. And that was a game where, hey, remember Castlevania 2? What if good? Whether or not that was a good game or not is subjective, and there's good things and bad things about it, but they were mired in design choices of the time and design philosophy of the time and quality of life updates that we can have now that weren't possible then. So you can take something imperfect, something flawed, but beloved or certainly remembered and build on it. And I think that is one of the ways that a game can be very important. It doesn't need to be good, but it's still important that it's remembered. It can then be iterated upon and a new idea because there is the thought, there is nothing new under the sun, but we are building on our own memories. We have the sort of retro graphics cycles that we do because indie developers and small studios crop up that are trying to recreate the vibes of the games they grew up with. And frankly, I love the fact that we're getting a lot of PS1 and 64 era graphics because it also, this is built off of a conversation that was going on in the Discord server a few days ago on allowing you to go back to some of those older games and looking at them and going, are they like timelessly good or were they just good at the time? Not having to worry about, well, the graphics are a little shoddy, a little whatever. We're getting those now. It's interesting to see where a game is remembered for its vibes or remembered for its gameplay or remembered for its ideas. Essentially, a game needs one important axis on that. And then someone can take their beloved memories of it and make something really good in the future. And I think that's wonderful.
Yeah, I know. I agree. I think that it's just as important to look at the mistakes or the problems or the things that were not good that still inform the history of video games. We often talk about the successes and the pivot points, but there are tons of pivot points also that were important to video games and lessons learned. Some may argue we're still learning some of these lessons over and over again, but we try our best.
I mean, that's life.
But like for me, something that comes to mind is the game Shaq Fu. There were definitely other sports stars featured on games, but the thing about Shaq Fu is that it featured Shaquille O'Neal, who had become a pop culture icon at that point, even outside of basketball. And the game itself was fairly rushed, low quality, and when it was released, everyone assumed that the name of Shaq would make this game a huge success. All it needed to do was be okay, and wasn't even that good. But like, it still ended up with this kind of cult following because it was about Shaq. It did lead to a sequel that was a beat 'em up called Shaq Fu: A Legend Reborn, which I've to this day still not played, but I heard was like fun in a kind of ironic way, but like still. Celebrity-led video games were huge in the 90s and 2000s, and they still come up. I think about it every time Hugh Jackman's face was put on the cover of an X-Men or Wolverine game that he wasn't in or even voicing. But like something like Shaq Fu showing just having a famous face on your game won't be enough to sell it. You need to make a good quality game behind it. It allows us to get games like X-Men Origins Wolverine, which was an excellent game by Ravensoft that did have Hugh Jackman in it and his face plastered all over it. I think it's one of those things. Did I see Deadpool and Wolverine recently? I did. Why do you ask? But like, I think that this is also a good example of, okay, we need to be tactical about what we're doing. And if we have a celebrity, we also need something to back it up. We can't just put out shovelware with someone's face on it and hope it to do well.
And some of these are even just from design ideas that were a good idea at the time, or were very of the time. Like making a fighting game that is, making Shaq Fu the fighting game. Like, yes, Shaq was also, Shaquille O'Neal was putting forth his own like martial arts sense of self kind of thing. But fighting games were huge at the time. If you were to do a Shaquille O'Neal or equivalent game now, what would the genre be? What would the idea be? Probably would just be a skin in an arena shooter. But that's neither here nor there. But it's interesting that we get things like that, because then you get games nowadays that are built on sort of the mascot-led personality ideas of yesteryear. I think the other thing that's important to remember here is some games are, a lot of games are bad. Even more games are mediocre. Some games are good, and a few games are amazing. But one of the reasons why we do side quests, and one of the reasons why we go about talking about games the way we do, is every game is potentially someone's favorite. To go outside video games for a moment, thinking of an example of something like that. Matt, did you ever watch the movie Phantom of the Paradise?
Yes, of course.
Okay, I had a feeling you would. If anybody listening hasn't seen Phantom of the Paradise, you don't have to watch it. Look it up. If the vibes look good to you, watch it. If they don't, just read about it. Maybe watch a clip or two. It is weird and wild and unhinged and musical and freaky as all get out. But I love that movie. And it didn't do well when it was released. It is very campy and it is very out there. And there's a reason why not everybody knows about it. I bring it up because it does have two very famous fans. Technically three, but it's under two headings. One of whom is Guillermo del Toro. The other one is Daft Punk.
Unsurprising.
Yeah, right. That's the thing. If you look up Phantom of the Paradise and you just go, was this the Rocky Horror awakening for Daft Punk? Probably. It probably was. To the point where Paul Williams was in the movie, and because Daft Punk were huge fans of the film, they got Paul Williams to be on their last album.
Yep.
Which is why he was on the track Touch. And that connection was because of that. And I love Random Access Memories. It's such a good album. Does everybody need to watch Phantom of the Paradise as homework for listening to Daft Punk's Homework? No. But it is a cool thing to see, and it is a case of, I'm sure we could dig at every cool, wild idea that we see in indie games these days, and somebody will talk about, I grew up playing this one game that might have just been because that was the game they had when they were 5 years old. And you're 5 and you can't get other games, and so you make the most of it. I mean, Matt, you and I definitely have games from Atari, NES, Super NES, and Sega Genesis and the like that they're not good games, but we love them because they're the games we grew up playing, and so we had the chance to know them intimately. And those will lend themselves towards the vibes that we like and the nostalgia that we carry, even as we carry the nostalgia for Super Mario Bros. 3 and Final Fantasy. That then gets into the idea of important in a historical sense globally versus important historically locally. Your own personal history, which is also something that we talk about a lot on this show.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that there's a lot of infamy in this topic, right? Games that are important because of how famously bad they were. Mm-hmm. Well, we don't need to go into the whole list of those. I mean, I think one of the most famous games in that category is Sonic 06.
Right.
The Sonic the Hedgehog game that was released on Xbox 360 that was notoriously buggy and incomplete and took a huge turn for the story and characters of the game. Was originally meant to be Sonic Adventure 3, but evolved. Robotnik looks more human. Sonic has a more lankier design, as does all the other characters in it. It's considered completely unplayable, though I do know people who have tried to play it, and is notoriously terribly rated. And one of the reasons why Sonic as a franchise took a nosedive. I mean, before Sonic 06, Sonic was celebrated. Not everybody liked Sonic Adventure 1 and 2, but they were pretty well regarded as far as good games that were fun to play. And then this tanked Sonic's reputation and took years to recover. Some might argue still hasn't recovered, and made them scramble for what comes next. And they've tried so many different things. But Matt, why are you saying this is a good thing? I think Sonic 06 is important to the history of video games because it shows that a franchise isn't invincible, right?
Right.
Mario Sunshine, I would argue also, and I'm not here to add to the conversation of whether it's a bad game or not. I'm not a fan of it. I have yet to replay it, but I think that Mario Sunshine and Sonic the Hedgehog are stunning examples of, even if a game is unloved or not well made, it can help a company pivot in a positive direction. Now, arguably, it took Sonic a long time, but I would say that later games were good. Sonic Generations is an incredible game. Of course, we got Sonic Mania. We're getting Sonic and Shadow Generations this year as of when we're recording. And same for Mario. Like, Sunshine didn't work out, but then we got Galaxy, Galaxy 2, Odyssey, and a ton of 2D games in between. I think historically bad games like this, like Sonic, I'm specifically talking about '06, again, not adding to the Sunshine conversation, are important because it reminds these companies they're not invincible, which I'm sure they know, but it's helpful on that kind of corporate level. But it also, I think, reminds the fans too that not every game's going to be perfect unless you're the devs who make the Yakuza games, because I am still not convinced they can make a bad game at this point. They can make okay games, but they can't make bad games, as the monkey's paw finger curls. But I like to always look back on Sonic the Hedgehog '06 because I think we ended up getting a diverse variety of Sonic games. Not all of them worked, but a lot of them were a lot of fun. I mean, I loved Mania. I loved Generations. I like Sonic Unleashed. I think the Werehog sections are tedious and long, but I think it was a cool idea. Take Sonic, do speed stages, and then do like action beat 'em up stages. It's a cool idea that I wish would get a remake, honestly, because I think if they tightened up the Werehog stuff, it'd be a pretty flawless Sonic game. It's an original story. There are no other characters from Sonic's world. It's a kind of a completely different story. And I think we got something like Sonic Unleashed because Sonic '06 did so poorly. Like, they're like, well, making the same thing again isn't working. We couldn't do it well, or we were rushed, or whatever the conditions were. Let's try something completely different. And they continued to do that. Sonic and the Secret Wing, Sonic and the Black Knight. Again, not all games that were good necessarily, but they tried something different. As much as I love Mario, Sonic has a more diverse history and has tried more things. Mario is experimental as well, but I feel like from 64 to Odyssey, mostly stayed in its lane with some minor changes that made it improve, but control-wise, style-wise, stayed pretty similar. And then don't even get me started on the new Super Mario Brothers games because they were a whole different set of problems. And I just think Sonic '06 is ultimately a good for Sonic team because it caused them to reflect, reminisce, and pivot. And we got some of the best Sonic games in the last decade as a result of it, like Generations, Colors, Mania, and so on.
You sometimes do need that wake-up call, yes. And from what I've heard, Sonic Unleashed also, unfortunately for Sonic Unleashed, has some of the best speed gameplay of its era, and certainly amongst other Sonic games that borrow from it that are then bogged down by the clunkier Werehog sections. Those Werehog sections either could show up again in a different form in a future Sonic game, or are inspiration to somebody going, but what if Werehog good? And went and made their own thing. But this also brings up a very interesting thing. Matt, you and I don't typically talk a lot about current events things, but this doesn't feel so much current events as it does just a general trend. Sonic '06 was a bit of a failure. I don't know how big of a financial failure it was, but it certainly was a cultural failure. And yet there are still Sonic games. And yet there is still Sega and Sonic Team. And like you noted, the games improved, or at least went in different directions and appealed to different people. They had the chance to dust themselves off and try again. We are currently in an environment where a lot of studios are closing on their first release, or things are being kind of cut off at the pass because certain metrics aren't being reached, or because impossible numbers are being sought, or an ever-increasing reach for growth. None of these statements are meant on any specific level, but you hear echoes and see shades of it, or complete line drawings of it, in a lot of corners if you're looking around. And a lot of indie studios close, and you don't even get the big layoff announcement about it because there was a cultural miss on something that came out. Whereas we learn more from our failures than we do from our successes. And so there are interesting games that are out there that aren't perfect games, but they're important games. Games that are worth going back to because there's some great creator's first title, and you can see the shades of where they're coming from and where they're going to go by playing it. It's the same thing as, I'm a big Terry Pratchett fan. One of the guiding principles, almost like law number one of getting into the Discworld series, don't start with the first book. There's a lot of different small series that go on within the Discworld saga, oeuvre world. You can go back and read Color of Magic and Light Fantastic if you want. If you're really into Rincewind and an Unseen University, go for it. But don't start with the first one. Terry Pratchett himself was like, this wasn't very good. GNU Terry Pratchett. The thing is, he was able to keep writing and get better. And every book was just an improvement and building upon. And the same goes for games. And it's good when a game is given a chance to try and to fail and to become something better. I mean, Matt, I definitely think you should go back and try Mario Sunshine again. I can't guarantee that you're going to love it, but I think you'll find some cool things in it. But I think that's very much in favor of a game doesn't have to be good to be important. And there's a lot of, again, shovelware and bad game practices that are going on that I feel go hand in hand with why there's a lot of closures. Then it's not one-to-one, but I don't think they're not unrelated. I do want a world where we're allowed to have some more interesting bad games out there. Not things like the SimCity debacle of Always Online back in 2013. That's an interesting one that's important because it showcases the bad idea, even nowadays, of having always online gameplay for a lot of genres and a lot of experiences. You can't do it everywhere, and you probably shouldn't do it in a lot of places, and showing that it's not even people voting with their wallets, it's that sometimes you just reach too far and it falls apart and it's just a bad idea.
Yeah, I mean, the always online thing is a good example. There's a more recent casualty of it. I mean, Suicide Squad, for a whole host of reasons, was a disappointment and a problem. But one of the biggest problems is it's always online. Now, the studio has said that because of what's going on, they're sunsetting some of the DLC plans they made, but they are working on an offline mode. So people who own the game, who want to play, can still play it, even if the servers don't stay online and they can't play multiplayer. But the game was designed to be multiplayer. So, like, that's a whole other host of issues. And, like, lessons aren't always learned from these major moments in history. But I think something also worth talking about in this topic is games that are failures that then still get to be successes. And we've seen it many times.
Yeah.
And there are any number of reasons why it can happen. I mean, obviously, one of the more famous ones, there are two that come to mind. Cyberpunk 2077, which was a completely broken mess when it came out, though people loved it even then. But definitely, like, in the history of the online store for PlayStation issuing refunds because Cyberpunk said they would. And so the PlayStation store had to follow suit, and it was a whole thing. But, like, I played Cyberpunk this year, and I loved it. It's the closest I felt to replaying a different version of Mass Effect, right? Like that kind of world building, that kind of relationship building. But I wouldn't have gotten that in 2020. I got it in 2024 after the DLC, the updated systems, all of that stuff. You know, the probable actual dev cycle the game should have been. But it's neither here nor there.
Right.
I'm reminded of Final Fantasy XIV, which was famously a mess at launch and hated. It did so poorly that the devs decided, let's nuke this game and start over. And they then baked that into the narrative of the game. When you play A Realm Reborn, you see the Great War. They talk about the Great War and all those people who died. There are statues dedicated to player characters and NPCs from the before time. And now it's one of the, well, I can safely say, I think at this point, the most successful MMO ever made. I don't think WoW holds a candle to it anymore. If it does, it's very close, but I'm pretty sure Final Fantasy XIV, which is free to play now, all the way up to the expansion Heavensward. Sorry, I'm just memes are memes. But like
Memes are memes.
I think that these are important things to look at in the history of games. They're not bad games now, but they were. And there have been a ton of those that have come out and then like got adjusted, or others that don't. And I think looking at that as a case study also of these games that were bad and there was no hope of them being good, and yet somehow they persisted and were able to be good, it leads into what you were talking about. They were given this time to fail and then recover. And we just don't see that anymore. I mean, I think about, as of when we're recording, the recent Bungie layoffs from the I bought too many cars CEO of that company. Lightbringer was not well received, but then they doubled down on the final shape, which was supposed to end this long story that's been ongoing since Destiny 2 started. And they hit the mark. Like, fans are happy, people are enjoying it, and then they still have all these layoffs. Arguably, the newest expansion was a huge hit, and months later, they have these giant amount of layoffs. And it's a thing we see time and time again. Insomniac layoffs after Spider-Man came out. Like, games aren't given a chance to fail and find their footing. Arcane Austin and Redfall and all of that. Like, I think these examples of failures that then pulled themselves up by their bootstraps by working their fucking asses off, it gets into a whole other conversation about companies and wanting money and not caring about the quality of the art and all of that. And we don't have time to break into that. But I think these two games, though, among several others, are just good examples of like, hey, maybe we let things find their footing, like a TV show that was bad the first season, but then really takes off in the second, third, and fourth seasons, right? It feels like that's less and less common. And I think this is not maybe something that we've learned from video games yet, but we should. And now I know it's more complex than that, the issues that make these things happen. But also, these giant executives with their huge pockets and spending too much money on cars are not pumping that money back into the business. So if the business is failing, like, whose responsibility is that? It's the person running the show. But I think that games being able to take this time to find their footing is really important to the games industry and the future of video games, which we're just not really seeing now.
If Mega Man was judged solely on its first entry, we would not have the empire it would have today.
Correct. Same with Street Fighter.
Yeah, absolutely. Titles that we think about where it's just like, did you ever play the first one? I don't know. System Shock 2 gets talked about all the time. Who played System Shock 1? Plenty of people, but how many did? If Final Fantasy was judged on its first entry, it was a good game. It's not one that I would send anyone back to these days, but I do love a lot of the Final Fantasy titles, and so nothing is a perfect work. And quirks of culture, of time, of software, of hardware, of marketing, of anything goes into what allows games of equal quality to rise or fall, necessarily. In the same way that every game is potentially someone's favorite, I think there's something to learn from every game that's out there. It's another reason why I'm all for physical collecting and why I'm all for archiving of games, and one of the reasons why always online games do make me a little sad, because when the server goes down, it all falls apart. Recently, the Xbox 360 marketplace was shut down. A lot of games get lost in that. There's a great deal of them that on first blush you look at it, you kind of go, good riddance. I don't need that anymore. I don't need to worry about that anymore, but there's memories in there for people, and there's lessons for everybody if you have the eyes to see and the mind to play. I'm not saying everybody needs to play every game that's out there ever, but that there is merit and there is value in the vast majority of video games that are released, large and small, and often the small has some really cool things to learn.
For sure, yeah. I mean, I think there's a larger topic to talk about, like the success of sequels and their first versions that are forgot to time. I mean, Mega Man and Street Fighter are just a couple of them. But I mean, even on some other scale, like you think about even Silent Hill 2 and Resident Evil 2. Like the first games are beloved by people, but the sequels are where they locked in, right? They really figured out what they were doing. And I think that's not an uncommon thing, but I think I don't want to argue about it. Mega Man 1 is a bad game. Like it's playable, but it's a bad game. But Mega Man 2 revolutionized side-scrolling shoot-'em platformers, and we've gotten so many games since that are like that game. Also, the best title screen probably in the history of the NES, at least, is that opening scene in Mega Man 2. It's another way of learning from history, right? Finding success in the sequels. Then there are some sequels that die. Also, I mean, I think of like the 2017 Star Wars Battlefront 2 that was maligned because of the bullshit that EA put in it and had potential to be a good second version of Battlefront 2, since we got Battlefront 1 and 2 a decade earlier.
Yeah, right.
Like, it shows trends in history. I think about Overwatch now and how it's Overwatch 2, but everything in the store is mostly purchasable. There are no more loot boxes, and how in that case, I would argue loot boxes were better because you could at least earn stuff without spending money. It's a whole other host of things. And I think that the answer to the question, are bad games necessary? Yes, 100%, definitively, without a second thought, because we learn from our mistakes. It's cheesy and it's an old thing to say, but like it's true. You know, you can't learn from the mistakes you don't make. And I think some people can ignore those mistakes, but it's still often important to look back on. I mean, I think about the yearly releases of Assassin's Creed and how Unity in its original form was a goddamn mess. They've since fixed it, and it's, I don't think perfect, but well, it's still quite playable. This was another franchise that was thought to be untouchable and then released this thing that was a mess. I think about the recent Call of Duty that was like basically an expensive multiplayer pack with a piss poor campaign. And I'm not even a huge Call of Duty fan, but I know folks who love those games were disappointed. And I think when money is involved in the modern gaming landscape and it becomes less about the art and what we're creating, it's harder to learn from these mistakes. I think a discussion like this, when we're looking back on gaming's worst, is important because it allows us to look at the future of like, all right, how do we pivot? And I think that direct through line, to bring it back to the CDI games, to RZ, is really important because, again, someone made something they love out of something they did love that was a commercial failure and a historically terrible video game, but it didn't stop someone else from loving it and making something they love. CDI, as a developer, their whole ethos was born out of this thing that people hated and that was historically maligned and terrible. And I think keeping focus on that is key in figuring out how to grow this industry and the kinds of things that can go wrong and how we avoid them in the future.
Yeah, it's that whole thing of, I want to be able to teach people, if only as a warning to others. Because we play these games. We play good games. We play bad games. You could play a game that you think is the greatest game ever made. Somebody else plays it and goes, nah, this sucks. All of us, everybody who plays video games, I feel safe saying, has at least at one point that thought of, if I were making this game, I'd do this. Some people think about that a lot. Some people will keep extensive notes on game ideas that they've had based off of good or bad games they've played, or learning about good or bad games that have happened historically, or learning about old games and going, well, what would that look like if you took that idea now, and playing with that. And the population on this gets smaller and smaller. Some people will actually attempt to make those games, and some people do. And a proportion of them are very, very good. Those are those retro throwback games that we talk about. Those are the Shovel Knights. Those are the Messengers. And I don't want to speak for games that aren't out yet, but ones I'm excited about, like Lucid, as well as Animal Well, or any of these other ones that are built on all sorts of lessons and shoulders of, well, if it were my game, I'd do this. And then people do make their own game. And sometimes those are great games, and sometimes those are just the next set of shoulders that an even greater game is going to stand on. But they have to have the chance to do it.
Yeah, I mean, I think about how we went through a phase in the 2000s of like how the gritty reboot was the way to do things. It was in movies, it was in TV, it was in video games. And a famously felt case of it is Bomberman Act Zero, where they made Bomberman this weird looking sci-fi cyborg. But when you play the game, it's still the exact same top-down, blowing stuff up game. And it's like, why?
Mm-hmm.
It was at a time when like gore, guts, and like adult games for adult people were like the thing. And Bomberman Act Zero proved maybe it won't always work. And I mean, Bomberman has continued on since. Thankfully, people came to their senses and went back to the cute aesthetic for it. But like, this was famously criticized for like, why did we need to make this gritty and real? Was this necessary? And it showcased that not everything needs that. Yeah, it can be fun to do that for stuff, and I'm not going to totally shoot it down. You know, I've seen clips of this like proof of concept of like a gritty Mega Man or Mega Man X game where it was like a third-person shooter and everything looked like hyper-realistic and the technology looked like super sci-fi. That seems fun. It could be interesting, but, you know, Bomberman Act Zero proved that it's not always going to work.
Yeah, and I'm glad we learned that. I'm glad that didn't become the new blueprint for Bomberman games or a lot of other things. I'm happy to be currently not in an age of gritty reboots, but we may unlearn that lesson or relearn a new one or whatever it is. But art keeps artin', games keep getting made, hopefully, and we never stop playing and we never stop dreaming about them. Unlike a lot of other times, a lot of other episodes where Matt and I discuss large ideas and then kind of go at, well, it depends. This one, I'm going to come down and say, yeah, a game does not have to be good to be important.
Yeah, I think the games that are bad also define our future just as much as the good ones, in the same way that I think all bad art is as important as good art. Now, there are limits to that, and I think anything hateful is not helpful. But I think within reason, failing is just as important as being successful, right? How do you know what success looks like if you haven't failed first? If you're just instantly successful at something, how do you know the consequences? And I think that taking stock of the Drake of the 99 Dragons of the world or the Superman 64s are just as important, right? I mean, there has to be an indie game out there somewhere where the whole point is to fly through rings, but it's really a lot of fun and super responsive. And honestly, good for them, because they learned something from what was probably one of the most infamously bad games ever. I actually am kind of shocked that we haven't roped Case into talking about Superman 64 yet. and Superman video games on the whole, since they all tend to be not great, to be charitable.
I think it's because none of us want to actually give in to the game of chicken and actually acquire these games.
That's also true. I have still not played Superman Returns on the Xbox 360 since it came out, but I am morbidly curious to return to it. I mean, also, I think bad games are important for personal taste, right? You don't know what tastes bad. I think what helps fine-tune our palates, both for food and other art, because food is art, right?
Can be.
Is taking in the stuff that is not good. And sometimes morbid curiosity is fun, can be funny. I think about a lot of the games that we mentioned today and how they were memed to death on the internet. And it's how Geoff and I osmosed most of the information about them, especially the CDI games. But I think ultimately conversation about this stuff is key, because it's how we, as people who like to play games, as well as folks who want to talk about games professionally or otherwise, can kind of expand how those conversations go, increasing our vocabulary of what we prefer based on what we've experienced.
Yeah, because it's very easy, and especially with the number of games that are out there, the sort of reviews that are called for or have been historically, it's very easy to wrap up a game in a number score or a TLDR or a short summary, and that's about it. Like a lot of broad strokes, that will cover many situations, but not all of them. It's why in recent episodes we've talked about the power of personal recommendations and being able to talk about these sorts of things with other folks and word of mouth power, because you do need to have some nuance. Good games have flaws. Bad games have great points. And it can only be to your benefit to, develop your vocabulary and develop your palate on these sorts of games to then go, I don't like this game because XYZ. Sometimes it can just be, I love playing this game, but I can't stand the predatory practices and the dark patterns therein. I love the shooting mechanics, but I don't love the cutscenes that happen every 3 steps I take. My God, let me shoot some aliens. I love the story that's going on, but if I have to navigate all of these menus to deal with each of my party members' upgrades, and there's no auto option, I'm going to scream. Menus appeal to some people, like me. Cutscenes appeal to all, like any of these aspects, vice can be virtue and virtue can be vice. You don't have to give everybody an explanation for what you love and hate about games. We do. That's why we started a podcast. Well, one reason amongst many. But being able to answer that for yourself is only going to help you find better games in the future and help your community and your friends find the games that they love too. Really, at the end of the day, Matt and I just want to find good, fun games, and we want you to do the same.
Yeah. So let us know what you think are some impactful bad games that have come out, or if you have a personal bad game that was important to your history with video games and how you pivoted on the kinds of games that you play. I think these conversations are important to have, and I know we love having those conversations. My brain was going one way and my mouth was going the other, but that happens sometimes. Also, before we start to do our full wrap up, Geoff and I have been promoting some of the other stuff we've done around the internet on our Patreon episodes, which you can join at patreon.com/funandgamespod to hear our bonus episode every month. But I think we should start squeezing into the main episodes as well, the stuff we've been doing, because we're both doing a lot more. And in the month of August, when this will release and when we are recording it, Geoff and I have done a bunch of recent episodes of podcasts about video games. Going forward, I want to be able to promote the other stuff Geoff and I are doing as we start to do more and more stuff, because we're lunatics.
Yep.
Some crazy person who might schedule 12 podcasts over the course of 4 weeks, but I'm not naming names. It's me. I'm talking about me. But I want to make sure that we give those roses to those shows too, because we go on them for a reason. And so I recently got to return to the Retro Hangover podcast to do an episode about my favorite game of all time. You guessed it, Chrono Trigger. I basically bullied the hosts into letting me on the episode because they were covering my favorite game of all time, which, if you know me, I'll talk about it. I also recently guested on Nostalgia Marcanum again to cover a video game again, this time talking about Super Mario 64. If anyone has been listening to the show long enough, they know that's a seminal game for me. And so you should definitely go check out both of those shows. They are on all of your favorite podcast platforms and really deserve your ears because they are great shows.
Yeah, and I was recently on Retro Rehab podcast, where we sort of made an AirSats video game quiz show where Aaron and Jerry did a bang-up job of answering all of my trivia and questions, and I think I want to host more video game trivia. It's a lot of fun to do all of that.
You hear that, Jacob? Someone's coming for your ass. You're not the only video game trivia guy.
I think we can only improve each other. And that's all I'm setting out to do. Jacob is an inspiration, and I will say that
Fair
publicly. No, I will say that publicly. I will say that privately, and anytime, anywhere. Stand-up guy and a great host. So
That's true. 100%.
Yeah, that's fine. As well as guesting recently on Still Loading podcast, talking about my current forerunner for Game of the Year, Animal Well. I didn't know how long the episode was supposed to be. We ended up talking for like 3 hours, and it got edited down to about 2 hours and change. So I regret nothing, and I think it's all very worthwhile. And if you're as into those sorts of things as me, please listen to some of it at least. We spent more time than I figured getting to talk about the game before we hit the spoiler wall. So even if you haven't played the game yet, I think there's a lot worthwhile to listen there. Matt and I were also both recently enough on the Great Game Debate talking about, well, we were finding games that are sort of going to be forgotten and lost to history, or ones that we thought would be and are worth remembering, as well as just a lot of other just good, goofy discussion.
Yeah, definitely go check all that stuff out.
Yeah, check out all of those great podcasts. Thank you so much for checking us out. And please, let us know about some of the important games that aren't necessarily good ones, the significant ones in your history that influence the games that you like today, the games that you'd never play again, but you would never give up the time that you spent with them. I'm going to say this right here. I don't like Shenmue. I think Shenmue is a bad series and bad games. But I firmly believe we would not have the Like a Dragon series without them. And by that alone, by that virtue alone, those are points in my book for Shenmue. But if you have a firm belief that I am so extremely wrong, let me know. Come at me. Or other games like it, reach out to us. There's so many great ways to reach out to us. We are Fun and Games Pod across all social media that we are currently active on, which, as of this episode, is Twitter, Blue Sky, Instagram, TikTok, and Tumblr. You can email us at funandgamespod@gmail.com. Let us know what you thought of this episode, what you thought of previous episodes, who you'd like us to talk with, what you'd like us to talk about in future episodes. If you're interested in being on SideQuest, that's also a great place to reach out to us, because then we can have that discussion going about what games are available and where you can record and celebrate a game that you love. Perhaps a game that is important, if not necessarily good. If you would like to support us or have a one-stop spot for all of the things that we're working on, you can go to our Patreon, patreon.com/funandgamespod. There is a free tier, but we appreciate all of those that have chosen to support us, especially those up on the high score tier and above. Today, the high scoreboard is Alex Lavelle, Case Aiken, Daniel Needon, Roger Reichart, Alejandro Alves, Curly Bright, Film It Yourself, Patrick Edwards, Robert Prine, Sean Bowen, and Wes Bates. Thank you so much for your support. Please enter your initials. Every letter you move to on the keyboard opens up a short cutscene that happens. The animators worked really hard on it, and yes, there is like a half second of loading each time, but it's fine. I think you're really going to like the designs, and I hope after you've entered those 3 letters that you'll look back on this fondly. If you want to continue these sort of discussions, you can visit certainpov.com and find not only all of our other great podcasts, but a permanent invite link to our Discord server where a lot of these conversations continue, and several episode topics have been inspired by those discussions, and we'd love to see you there.
Yeah, join the Discord. It's been really a lot of fun. It's gotten really lively over the last couple of years, having great conversations both about video games and then other nerdy pursuits as well. Also, if you don't have the ability financially to support us via Patreon, A-OK. Something you can do that's completely free and only takes a few minutes is to rate us on your favorite podcast platform of choice. Spotify allows you to give ratings. Apple allows you to give ratings and reviews. I believe Pocket Cast also allows ratings. Good Pods, pretty much wherever you can give us a rating or a review, please do, because it helps push this to the top of the algorithm. So when people search for Are Good Games Important, or whatever the hell we end up calling this episode, you'll find this episode.
That's way up in the air. I figure those things out like 3 hours before I post this.
Yeah, it's very much easier to compare things when we're like talking about a specific subject, but when we do nebulous stuff like this, it's like, I don't know, scattershot Google search, you'll find us, I guess. But that said, all those rating and reviews do help push us up to the top of the pile, so we really do appreciate it.
Absolutely. Whatever way you support the show, whether through Patreon, through interacting with us on social media, sending us pictures of your video game collection over email, rating and review the show, or even just listening to this one episode. Thank you so much. We really couldn't do this without you. This is a conversation. Thank you for being a part of it. I'm Geoff Moonen.
And I'm Matt A.K. Stormageddon.
And happy gaming.
Are you tired of watching your beloved characters being tortured by careless authors?
Are you sick of feeling like they could have swapped out all of the painful action and the plot would remain untouched? Subscribe to Books That Burn, the fortnightly book review podcast focusing on fictional depictions of trauma.
We assume that the characters' reactions are reasonable and focus on how badly or well they were served by their authors.
Join us for our minor character spotlights, main character discussions, and favorite non-traumatic things in the dark books we love.
Find us on Spotify, iTunes, Google Play, or wherever you get your podcasts.
CPOV. CertainPOV.com.